my name is Vernon Burton. I grew up in the country near a small rural town that had a cotton mill, and that's where I grew up. I spent most of my career at the University of Illinois. Had two stints in the Army, but I went after I did my PhD at Princeton University. I taught for 34 years at the University of Illinois, and I taught the American South and race relations at the University of Illinois. And I wrote a book, The Age of Lincoln, which was very popular there. And I retired and went where I'd always wanted to teach, the American South. So I now teach at Clemson University, but I discovered that as opposed to the University of Illinois, who love Lincoln, that people in South Carolina were not as favorable to Lincoln. In fact, the culture wars have had a horrible effect on how people view history and how they relate to one another. So that's one of the things that I have been trying to do. Such I did a big conference at Clemson. The book is coming out pretty soon. I think, in fact, in May, called Lincoln's Unfinished Work, which comes from his two greatest speeches, both the Gettysburg Address and then the second inaugural. And I take that literally, that he is saying that we need to continue to work to make democracy work and become sort of the, well, I like to say that Lincoln, who said that he would be known for anything, would be for the Emancipation Proclamation, the most important thing he did. But I think even more important was that he took what was basically our mission statement, that is the Declaration of Independence, and put it into our rule book, the Constitution, which leads me into the most recent book I've done, which is Justice Deferred, Race in the Supreme Court, which I'm very proud of. One of the few good things that came out of COVID was that I was isolated and finished this book with a longtime friend, one of the greatest civil rights lawyers of the modern era, Armand Durfner. We started working together in 1980 in court cases for minority plaintiffs, mostly in the South, but it quickly expanded to, Texas and California and other places. And it all came about, as they say, is the famous ball pair philosophy. Yogi Berra said it's almost deja vu all over again, because in 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that it didn't matter that laws disadvantage minorities. In this case, it was a court case called Mobile versus Alabama, that just because the laws kept African Americans, who were a significant proportion of the population, from being able to elect a candidate of their choice, unless, according to the Supreme Court, unless the intention of those laws, the purpose of those laws, not the effect, but the purpose of the policymakers had been to disfranchise and keep African Americans from having an equal opportunity to elect them, that it didn't matter. So attorneys, civil rights attorneys, knew that historians understood how to study and prove intent and purpose. And I remember newspapers like the New York Times and WAG saying, like, well, what are we going to do? Dig up those policymakers, the legislators from 1911 in their graves and ask them, did you intend to discriminate against Black people? So that's how I got involved. And that's where I met my co-author. And, as in Casablanca, they say, it was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. And we began talking about these issues about race and the Supreme Court now since 1980, and has finally resulted in this book, Justice Deferred, Race in the Supreme Court.
Thank you so much for that. Just as a kind of a prep, as we are still looking at the background to sort of set the context of the conversation. This is many years now that since you'll be following this case. Actually, the conversation today that we are having, I look at it as America's struggle to be a fair state, a state where everyone is treated equally. I want to believe that that is part of your struggle also, because later in the conversation, we're going to look at some of the statement that you have made and also from your book, so that you can sort of clarify that for us. But just now, I would like to know from your perspective, looking at the time you started to write about a fairer state, a fairer treatment of other people that are living, that of course make up the United States. And today, 2022, what kind of comparison would you make?
Well, it's rather frightening. I did not think that we would ever be going the direction that we're going, but studying the Supreme Court and race, and really the new book looks at the history of race in America from before there was a United States until we were actually covered through the Amy Coney Barrett's nomination in 2021, and even predicted a court case that has bad consequences for minority scholars, for minority people in America as well. But I didn't think we would go back the way we're going. In fact, it's rather frightening. I think that democracy itself is in a crisis that we haven't seen in the United States since the Civil War, that is the 1860s. And the similarities are so great, it is rather frightening. A lot of people did not understand why Lincoln thought keeping the Union together was so important at that time. And he's gotten into a lot of criticism because Abraham Lincoln was willing to sign a 13th Amendment that said that slavery could stay where it was. It couldn't expand, but it would stay in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, because he thought the Union was so important. And the reason is Lincoln knew his history as opposed to so many of our leaders today. So the Confederacy, which was moving toward authoritarianism and a hierarchical society, was much more in line with the rest of the world than the United States was. People forget that after the American Revolution, then there were revolutions in France. Republics grew up all over the world. Mexico was a republic. Democracies were thriving as people began to think you didn't have to live in a hierarchical society where you were in your place in society was determined by where your father was, and it was sort of a rank order in terms of God to the king, the monarch to dukes, and all of the sort of hierarchy, so that everyday people just had to accept where they were. But what we forget is, like the musical that I love, Les Miserables, that Napoleon restored the monarchy in France, and the rest of the world was moving that way. Napoleon III put Maximilian on the throne in Mexico, which had been a democracy. Garibaldi, the hero of two continents who had fought in Latin America for democracy, comes back and he reunites where you are now, Italy, and he thought it would be a democracy. Instead, they opted for a monarchy. So that is why Lincoln was so determined to make democracy work in the United States. And where do we find ourselves today? Looking at the same situation, authoritarianism, regimes, hierarchical regimes growing throughout the world, and even in the United States, people calling for this sort of authoritarianism. And Lincoln's answer was that because when he said the United States is the last best hope in the world, he really meant it. So what he believed in was, on one hand, you're going to have total sort of authoritarian regimes or countries, and if you didn't have law or some sense of order, then you'd have anarchy. So his answer was the Constitution and the rule of law. And that's why I like to say how important he was, that with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, he took that Declaration of Independence that says all men are created equal, and now we can say in a larger sense, all people are created equal, and put it into the Constitution itself, our rule book.